Hello viewers, my discussion today is cerebellum. If you can remember in the introduction to the neuroanatomy in my previous videos, I discussed about the cerebellum and the cerebral hemispheres, where I said that the two cerebral hemispheres are called the larger brain, while the cerebellum is called the smaller brain. So my discussion today is cerebellum, and for easy understanding by the students, I made it to be rule of 3. So with this rule of 3, I'm going to discuss the external features of the cerebellum, and later on I will also discuss the internal structures of the cerebellum. So from the external features of the cerebellum, going by this rule of 3, we can say that cerebellum has 3 functional parts: cerebellum, the spinocerebellum, and vestibulocerebellum. The functions of each of these parts of the cerebellum is cerebellum is responsible for the motor coordination of our body, while the spinocerebellum is responsible for the proprioceptive information coming from our own different parts of our body, while the vestibulocerebellum is responsible for the maintenance of balance and posture. So cerebellum has 3 hemispheres. We have 2 cerebellar hemispheres, left and the right, and the last one is the vermis. Even though vermis is not a hemisphere, but for easy understanding, I put it as part of the hemispheres. The cerebellum, in most of your textbook, you will see that it is made up of 2 surfaces. But in the real sense, cerebellum has 3 surfaces. We have the superior surface that is in relation to the inferior aspect of the occipital lobe of the cerebral hemisphere. And so this, superior surface of the cerebellum is in relation to one fold of membrane, what we call the tentorium cerebelli. This tentorium cerebelli is a double fold of the dura mater that is covering the superior aspect of the cerebellum, so that it separates the cerebellum from the 2 cerebral hemispheres. So by and large, that is it. And the outer surface is the inferior surface. So I have said that it has its inferior surface in relation to the inferior surface of the occipital lobe of the cerebral hemispheres, and then it has also the inferior surface. So the inferior surface is lying within the posterior cranial fossa. So in essence, it is suffice to say that cerebellum is located in the posterior cranial fossa. So now we've seen the superior surface of the cerebellum, and then we have seen the inferior surface of the cerebellum. The other surface, which is the anterior surface, is in relation to the back of the midbrain. So it's suffice to say that cerebellum lies below the large brain, posterior to the midbrain, and lying inside the posterior cranial fossa. And so we have seen the 3 surfaces of the cerebellum: superior surface, which is this one; inferior surface, which is this one, with regard to the floor of the posterior cranial fossa; and then we have the anterior surface that is lying in relation to the back of the pons and the medulla oblongata, and the 4th ventricle that is lying in between the 2 structures, that is in between the cerebellum, anterior surface, and the posterior part of the brainstem itself. So we have now seen the 3 surfaces of the cerebellum. The other 3 is the 3 notches that the cerebellum has. Cerebellum has 2 important notches. One lying anterior in the anterior surface of the cerebellum, that is the anterior notch here, which is very shallow as compared to the one that is in the posterior aspect. This anterior notch is shallow and wider, while the posterior notch, which is this one, is narrower and deeper as compared to the anterior notch. And so this posterior notch of the cerebellum is, accommodating what we call falx cerebelli. This falx cerebelli is a dural fold of the dural fold that is separating the two cerebellar hemispheres. And so the other notch, which is actually not a notch, but rather a gutta, if you look at the inferior surface of the cerebellum, you are going to see a gutta that is lying at the inferior aspect of the vermis. So that is, the third notch or gutta related to the cerebellum. So similarly, cerebellum has three major functions. These three major functions include motor coordinations, voluntary motor coordination, all the movements that we do, whether flexion, extension, running, jumping, and so on and so forth. So the cerebellum is responsible for coordination of this motor movement of our own body. So the second one is maintenance of the muscle tone. So the muscle tones is also being maintained by the cerebellum, and the other one is maintaining of posture and balance, with regard to our own body. So these are the three major functions of the cerebellum. So similarly, if there is a lesion of the cerebellum, we also have three important, symptoms or signs, with regard to the lesion of the cerebellum. So the first lesion, which I've not written here, if you have lesion of the cerebellum, you have what we call dyssynergia. Dyssynergia means lack of coordination of motor movement, because I've already made mention that the cerebellum has three major functions. One of the functions is motor coordination. So once you have cerebellar lesion, so you have lack of or absence of coordination of our own voluntary motor activities, and that is what is called dyssynergia. And the other one is hypotonia, because there is no muscle tone, as being maintained by the cerebellum. So if there is a lesion of the cerebellum, so there is what we call hypotonia, because part of the functions of the cerebellum is to maintain the tone. The other one is maintenance of the posture. So if there is a lesion of the cerebellum, so there is what we call disequilibrium. Disequilibrium, that means there is no equilibrium with regard to our own body. So these are the three signs that one can see if there is a lesion of the cerebellum. So cerebellum, if you look at it, it has three important structures. But see, we have the gray matter, and this gray matter is similar to the gray matter around the larger brain. If you can remember, the two cerebral hemispheres, they have been coated by the cerebral cortex, and that is the gray matter. And the gray matter coating the cerebellum is entirely different from that one that coats the cerebral hemisphere, in that this gray matter is being folded, within the substance of the two cerebellar hemispheres, in that it forms something like a leaf-like structures within the white matter of the cerebellum. And so the next, substance or matter of the cerebellum is white matter. And so by this dipping of this gray matter into the white matter of the cerebellar hemispheres, so each of this leaf-like deepening of the gray matter into the substance, white matter of the cerebellum, that is what we call folium. This folium is similar to the gyrus with regard to the cerebral hemispheres. So the folding of this gray matter into the substance of the cerebellum is what we call folium, and plural is called, folia. So cerebellum has a lot of folia, and so by so doing, by this arrangement, you will see that the white matter of the cerebellum, looks like that of a tree, and that is why it is called arborvitae. So it is called what? It is called arborvitae because the arrangement of this folia into the white matter of the cerebellum looks like a tree. And so within the white matter of the cerebellum, there are about 4 nuclei. This nuclei, I will discuss the functions of each of these nuclei if I discuss the internal structures of the cerebellum. So the cerebellum has three important matters. The gray matter, the gray matter being folded into foliae, leaf-like structures, and the white matter, and the arrangement of this foliae into this white matter is what is called abobite, and so it also has nuclei in there, which are 4 in number. And so this foliae is just to make or increase the surface area of these two cerebellar hemispheres, and it has been stated that about 80 to 85% of 80 to 85% of the gray matter of the cerebellum is being enclosed into this foliae of the cerebellum. So the remaining 10 to 15% of this gray matter of the cerebellum is the one that we see outside. So 10 to 15% of this gray matter is the one that is outside, but a major portion of the gray matter of the cerebellum is being folded into this foliae. So the foliae are in hundreds, with regard to as compared to the gyri of the cerebral hemispheres. The cerebellum also has 3 lobes. We have the anterior lobe that is being separated from the posterior lobe by the primary fissure, or what is known as fissure primer. And so we also have the posterior lobe, and this posterior lobe is just at the back of the anterior lobe. And then the last lobe is the flocculonodular lobe. So if you look at this diagram below here, you are going to see that this is the anterior lobe of the cerebellar hemisphere, each of the cerebellar hemisphere. And so the posterior lobe is this one. This is the posterior lobe. And so in between the anterior and the posterior lobe, we have this primary, fissure of the cerebellum, and then the other one is the flocculonodular lobe. And this flocculonodular lobe is in relation to the posterior lobe of the cerebellum. And so this flocculonodular lobe is separated from the posterior lobe of the cerebellum by what is known as posterolateral fissure. It has been stated that this posterolateral fissure is the first fissure that develops during embryology of the cerebellum. So we have seen that cerebellum has 3 lobes: anterior lobe, posterior lobe, the two together separated by the primary fissure or fissure primer, and then the flocculonodular lobe that is separated from the posterior lobe by the posterolateral fissure. So it's supposed to say that the cerebellum also has 3 fissures. These 3 fissures include horizontal fissure. This horizontal fissure is just like, it's between the anterior superior part of the cerebellum and inferior part of the cerebellum. The other one is the posterolateral fissure, which is separating the posterior lobe from the flocculonodular lobe. And then the other one is the primary fissure that is separating the anterior lobe from the posterior lobe, which is this one. So this is the primary fissure, and this is the posterolateral fissure between the posterior lobe and the flocculonodular lobe. And then the horizontal fissure is between the upper part of the cerebellum and the lower part of the cerebellum. And then the last rule of the 3 is that cerebellum has 3 peduncles. These peduncles, they connect the cerebellum with the brainstem. So the brainstem, if you can remember, has 3 parts. We have the midbrain, we have the pons, and then we have the medulla oblongata. So the first peduncle connects the midbrain with the cerebellum, and that is the superior cerebellar peduncle. And the other one connects the pons with the cerebellum, and that is the middle cerebellar peduncle. And the last one is the inferior cerebellar peduncle connecting the medulla oblongata with the cerebellum. So we have these 3 peduncles, bundles of white matter connecting the brainstem with the cerebellum. And in each of these peduncles, there are information either going in or out of these 3 peduncles, which I will discuss later on when I'm going to discuss the functional anatomy of the cerebellum. So viewers, thank you very much for watching this video. The next video will be about the functional anatomy of the cerebellum.